Given the massive contraction that we saw in the second quarter, is it fair to assume that perhaps for the full year GDP, we're seeing a contraction closer to the 7% projection?
Thank you, Haslinda. There are a couple of downside factors that we still need to watch closely before we make any conclusion for the rest of the year. The biggest downside risk at this point in time will be how the global demand for Singapore products and services will be. As you have seen in the earlier reports, there are now more closures in various major economies because of the coronavirus, and we are very concerned that there will be a second wave, if not a third wave or recurring waves of infection across the world, which will cause the demand from these economies to further shrink. So that is, I think, the greatest uncertainty that we are having to deal with. The contraction that we have seen within Singapore was largely attributed to the circuit breaker measures. So that is within our expectations and that is within our control. But what we cannot control is the situation beyond Singapore and how that will have repercussions on the Singapore's economy.
So it is the external environment, external demand remains really weak. Is there a sense of when Singapore's GDP can turn to the positive, can expand?
So, Haslinda, as you mentioned, the greatest uncertainty has to do with the external demand, and that is not something within our control, and it will be a bit difficult for us to say when the upturn will come about. But what we can do is to make sure that we position ourselves positively for the eventual recovery. And there are the following things that we will continue to do to position ourselves as a safe harbor for investment and talent. First, I think we need to make sure that we maintain our trade links with all the major economies and continue to diversify our links with as many economies as possible, diversify our markets, diversify our sources of material. Second, we will need to work with like-minded countries to uphold the global trading system and resist the protectionist tendencies brought about by the global pandemic. Third, internally, we will have to continue to make sure that we save our businesses and help them transform. Fourth, we will continue to upgrade the skills of our workers to make sure that they are ready for the eventual recovery.
Minister Chun?
And for both the businesses and the workers, I think the digital skill sets will be critical for our eventual recovery. So if we do this well, all this well, then I think we are well poised for the recovery.
Is there a need for another stimulus package on top of the 20% of GDP that's already been announced?
Well, Haslinda, as we mentioned, the greatest uncertainty and the downside risk at this point in time is the global external demand. And I don't think fiscal measures alone will be the most appropriate for this kind of challenge.
Are you concerned that there's a perception out there that Singapore is becoming less attractive for expat workers? We've seen during the pandemic how some foreign workers have lost their jobs, have lost their visas to work in Singapore because of just one infraction. Is there concern that amid all this, Singapore could appear to be less attractive?
Not at all, Haslinda. I think Singapore's attractiveness to global talent is dependent on multiple factors and not just on one particular factors. For example, we are a safe harbor for talent, and that's because we respect people's intellectual property. So this is part and parcel of the entire gamut of factors that make Singapore attractive.
Could you talk to us about your expectations of unemployment? Right now, there is an expectation of unemployment to reach as high as 4.5%. Is that too high?
That's entirely within our expectation, because when global demand falls, that it will impact on some of the manufacturing and services sector within Singapore. So this is part of the shift in the demand. But there's also another factor that requires us to work very closely with our companies to save jobs. And that is that some of the previous business models may no longer work, and we will need to develop new business models. For example, in the tourism and aviation industry, in the mines industry, we will need new business models to overcome the crisis.
Right.
So it's not just waiting for the demand to pick up again, as per some sectors where the business models are still relevant. there are also sectors where we need to develop new business models. But whatever it is, we are trying to help our businesses to transform so that they can get on with the businesses and make sure that the jobs are safe through this difficult period.
Minister, I want to touch on the recent elections. The ruling PAP had its weakest performance since independence, despite winning most of the seats. The party has talked about needing to do some soul searching. It said exactly that after the 2011 watershed election as well. How is this soul searching this time different from back then?
First, Haslinda, maybe a point of correction. I don't think this is the weakest electoral performance by the ruling party since independence. That's technically not correct. We achieved about 62% of the vote share. This is, of course, lower than the year in 2015, but higher than 2011. As in any election, after the election, we'll do a thorough post-mortem, and we'll always seek to do better. And I would be hesitant to ascribe one particular factor as causing the result. In any election, the electoral result is the result of multiple factors. And for us, has not been an easy election because it's done during the COVID-19 situation where many people have lost their jobs. And we have, from the onset, say that this will be a tough election because many businesses are suffering, many workers are suffering, and the uncertainties of the future are enormous.
I should correct myself. The weakest performance in terms of the number of seats won in Parliament. Will the results change the composition of the next cabinet?
We have ministers that have retired, and certainly there will be some changes to the cabinet, but that we will have to await the Prime Minister's decision.
How about in terms of leadership succession, Minister? Will there be any changes? What can be expected?
At this point in time, we are entirely focused on helping our businesses survive the difficulties and to save jobs. So when the time comes, I think that issue will surface. But at this point in time, we are totally focused on making sure that we take good care of Singaporeans and Singapore.
We've heard Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong saying that he acknowledges there needs to be better diversity in Parliament and the discussions. That's what the people are wanting. Does that mean that the PAP will be treating the opposition party differently from now?
We always want to treat the opposition parties with respect. And regardless whether it's opposition parties or the PAP, we all have to work together to transcend the challenges of the current moment. And that is, I think, what we have promised ourselves. And I think the opposition will also join the PAP in making sure that Singapore remain united and cohesive. Because the challenges that we are confronting now is not between the PAP and the opposition. The challenges that we are facing now is, as one country, how do we ride out the crisis and emerge stronger?
One of the other challenges is also deteriorating relations within the US and China. And we've seen how the national security law has been imposed on Hong Kong. Do you see any capital flows or even flows of people to the Lion City from Hong Kong as a result of that?
I think there will be capital flows from Hong Kong to other parts of the world because of this latest legislation. But I don't think it's only flowing to Singapore and not to other parts of the world. But if we move a step back, I think with or without this legislation, because of the pandemic, because of the US-China issues, even prior to this legislation, I think many people will be considering their options as how to diversify their portfolio to make sure that they can hedge the risk that's being brought about by all the geopolitical issues and the geo-economic issues, including the rising protectionism, the possible bifurcation of the global trading relationships, and the technological standards.